Good morning, KOTA territory. Welcome to KOTA's Political Pulse this morning. It is cloudy outside, but it's not cloudy here in the studio. I'm Humberto Giles-Sanchez, joined by investigative reporter Blake Troli. And we have a special guest this Monday morning, Amber Hulse. Really quickly, could you introduce yourself to some of our viewers who might not know what you do?
Absolutely. So I'm Amber Hulse. I'm a state senator here in South Dakota in the legislature. I represent District 30, which is Fall River, Custer, and parts of Pennington County. And then we have a citizen legislature in South Dakota. So my day job, I work for a political and election law firm.
Gotcha. Well, that is a lot and very impressive resume, if I do say so.
A great resume for the topic that we're doing today, of all things. You know, today we're talking about election integrity. There's a lot of moving parts on this in the state of South Dakota right now. I think the best place to begin with this is, why do you think there's so much interest, not only just this legislative session, but just in the ether right now in South Dakota with election integrity?
I think, you know, the 2020 election really obviously brought out a lot of grassroots movement across the country, but especially in South Dakota, of people wanting to make sure that our elections are fair, secure, and, you know, ethically run. And so, not that South Dakota doesn't do a great job already, but there's always room for improvement. And so, you know, there's been a lot of efforts, both within the legislature and in general citizenry groups, trying to ensure that any part of our election process that maybe has some gray areas or things that could be tightened up, we do that.
And what are, kind of talk about some of those, some of the bills that kind of passed this year in the legislature, or were talked about this year in the legislature, right? Starting with 1169.
We'll go with 1169. Well,
yes.
It passed the legislature. It's on the governor's desk right now. And Senator, you were saying that you think this is going to be possibly a hot veto day item.
Ooh. Yeah, so 1169, the bill would require, so if you're doing a initiated measure to propose a constitutional amendment, that it would require 10% of the votes cast for governor in the last election in each senatorial district. So that means that I'm in District 30. There's 35 districts across the state of South Dakota representing every single, you know, corner of the state, that a person gathering signatures wouldn't be able to just stand in Rapid City or Sioux Falls and Pennington or Minnehaha counties and collect the number of signatures that they need right now. If this law was put into place, you'd have to send out signature gatherers in like every corner of the state. And so the worry with it is that there's going to be a lot more out-of-state money coming in to try to sponsor some of these constitutional amendments, because it would just require that much more manpower and time to get something on the ballot. So while the intent was good, because we don't want just two counties, Rapid City and Sioux Falls, those areas dictating all of our elections, you know, there are some third and fourth order potentially bad effects that this bill could have, and so there's been a lot of discussion that the governor might veto it.
Yeah, I know we were speaking about one of the potential complications with this bill is just the fact that you might have an issue that matters a lot here in Rapid City, but you might have a small county that a district like Rapid City that's a lot more urban. You might be in a much more rural area where they might just not have the same appetite, or I guess you could say motivation to get involved with the ballot process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the intent of the bill, is so that one county isn't, or two counties really aren't controlling all of the political decision making, especially when it comes to a constitutional amendment. But then you also have the instance where if one county, if this bill passed, didn't want to, for whatever reason, sign petitions because whatever small interest they have, then they would be dictating to the rest of the state. Right. So that's kind of the concern. And then, you know, in addition to that, senatorial districts like my own, I only represent parts of Pennington County. And so the actual administration process of how this would work to the Secretary of State's office determining like which people are within which district in a county, because you know, Pennington County has, I think, 6 different districts that touch it, and Minnehaha is kind of a spoke wheel in the same way.
I'm just curious, and if you look at any of these bills, any of these election bills, especially given your background, and you say, I would have written it this way, I would have written it that way.
Yeah, I wish that this bill would have included maybe like half the senatorial districts or 18 or something like that, where it's not all of them, because we have senatorial districts way up in, you know, northwestern parts of South Dakota that there just aren't a lot of people there in general. And then if you have to get 10% of the people that voted in the gubernatorial race as signatures, I mean, that's going to take a lot of manpower. And, you know, if you're a part of that rural area, you're going to have signature gatherers knocking on your door a lot more, which might become annoying for some of those people as well, because they're, you know, one of the few families that are easy to get to out there in the rural parts of South Dakota.
Well, while we're talking about constitutional amendments, I do want to move into another measure that the voters are going to be, well, this is a measure that the voters are going to be deciding on, and it's kind of interesting. It's like the voters are going to be deciding on how the voters are going to be deciding.
Right.
This obviously came out of House Joint Resolution 5003 that would require 60% vote for a constitutional amendment to pass. I think right now it's a simple majority,
yes.
Correct? So I'm curious your thoughts on that and what it's going to be like trying to, or how you think the voters are going to actually respond to this.
Well, I think it's important to realize that, you know, when there's a ballot question on the ballot that you're voting on and it's to amend the Constitution, that's a very significant, serious thing, right? And so we want to make sure that we're only amending our Constitution when a majority, at least, of the people, but you know, in the legislature, we have all kinds of votes that require 2/3, and so I think it's important to raise that threshold because we don't want just a simple majority, you know, making an amendment, and so raising that threshold is important to protect the sanctity of our Constitution. But yes, it's funny because there could actually be another ballot measure amending the Constitution on the ballot next to this exact measure that only has to pass by a simple majority, and this amendment itself is only going to have to pass by a simple majority, but then we'll raise the threshold for all other ballot measures to come.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, kind of talking a little bit about that. I mean, we're asking you kind of what you think the voters are going to say. What have you heard actually from your constituents, at least regarding this?
There have been people that are a little bit concerned because, you know, if you're on the side that you want the constitutional amendment to pass, it makes it harder to do that. But that's the point of the bill, is that we don't want, I mean, last year, how many ballot questions did we have? Like 7 or 8, and I think 2 of them were amendments to the Constitution. And not that they were close, but when you're on the side that you don't want it to pass, you want it to be harder. But if you're on the side that you do want a ballot measure to pass, you have to put yourself in both shoes, right? And so I have had a couple constituents have some concerns because they have interest in amending our Constitution in a couple different ways. But if you're of, you know, some of the teams in the last few years that have been having to fight some of these out-of-state interest groups coming in and trying to do things in our own state, having that higher threshold, like if it's something that we really want to do, 60% of people are going to want to push it through anyway.
I'm curious, so I know some of these measures are to kind of get out-of-state money off some of these ballot or some of these constitutional amendment efforts, if you will. Can you explain to our audience why so much out-of-state money pours into the constitutional amendment process here in South Dakota and why that's a concern?
Well, first of all, money in South Dakota is much less than other states. So even when you're running for office in South Dakota, it's like 1/10 or even 1% of what it would cost to run for the same race in another area. And so South Dakota is often targeted by out-of-state groups because it costs them so much less money in order to make a broader impact. And that's part to do with our population and also just our economy. We don't have as big of donors in our own state, and so out-of-state people can come in and make a huge impact. But then you have these initiatives that are for topics like abortion, marijuana, things that have been rejected previously by South Dakotans year after year after year, and so that kind of just pushes more out-of-state money to come in, and there are these campaigns that are nationwide that are just trying to flip as many states as they can, and if they can put it in the Constitution, it's very hard to get that repealed. And so you see a lot more money in these constitutional amendments because it's a very serious impact, and it's long lasting if they can be successful.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, kind of talking a little bit about some of the downsides and upsides. I mean, what are some of the, what are some of the positives that you see at least from that? I mean, if there are any positives regarding kind of groups coming to the state and doing that, is there any positives that you see at least?
Well, I mean, it is always good to have South Dakota be a part of national conversations, right? Because we're often forgotten. We're a flyover state for most of people in politics. But, like I said, it depends on which side of the issue you're on, right? For most people, they say, I don't want any out-of-state interest groups at all in our state, regardless of if it's an issue that I like or not. And then you have other folks that say, no, if we really want to push through something that would be good for South Dakota, we'll take all the help that we can get. And so, it really just depends on where you feel on the issue and what side of the issue you're on.
Exactly.
Well, since we're talking about out-of-state voting, I think we should just move straight into 1066.
Okay.
This is another bill that's on the governor's desk right now, I believe. This would require people to live in South Dakota for at least 30 days before they can vote in elections. What are your thoughts on this bill? And did you hear any compelling evidence? I was curious about this in Pierre, that people who were hardly in this state, maybe here for a few days, are voting in our elections.
So South Dakota has a really interesting, law, I guess, loophole right now that people can come here. We're kind of considered what they call a nomad state. And so folks can come to South Dakota, get registered pretty easily, and then they're, full-time RVers, or they, are in the military, or just different circumstances than living in, a brick and mortar home with your white picket fence. They're just different circumstances. And so South Dakota is one of the states that welcomes those types of people. And so this bill, I think, the intention was to ensure that there aren't folks who are bad actors who really don't have any ties to South Dakota, that are just taking advantage of our looser laws in order to register to vote and then participate in local elections that they have no really interest in because they're not actually here. And so that's what the intent of this bill is. I do have a couple concerns about how it will affect, people who are either, not necessarily military members, because there's a lot of protections in federal law for those people, but folks that have, interesting careers, radio announcers, or not radio, but rodeo announcers that travel all around the country have had concerns with this. Truck drivers, anybody that you can think of that actually spends a lot of time on the road just due to their career, but they either have a presence here in South Dakota, or, this is their home, this is the place that they will return to, that they're domiciled in, but maybe they just don't have that traditional brick and mortar home, or are not privileged enough to have that. They still have the right to vote and should be able to vote in our elections if this is truly the place that is their home.
Yeah, I am kind of curious about that. So you say that you are getting some concerns on this. Again, we go back to your background with respect to law. It sounds like from your concerns with this bill, it's not so much the intent of the bill, but maybe the language.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of, I guess, gray area. I think that there could be some legal challenges when it comes to this bill. It doesn't just require a 30-day residency requirement, but it actually has a consecutive 30-day requirement. And how you prove that you were here for 30 consecutive days. If you had a lease for an apartment and you say 30 days ago you signed this lease, and you come in to register to vote and you show that you have your lease that was 30 days old, well, what if you spent a weekend away at your parents or relatives? Well, does that automatically then take away, you need to stay now for a whole nother month and consecutively stay and live and sleep in your apartment before that you can, I mean, there's a lot of gray area, and there's, folks that are going to challenge situations like that. And so I hope that this is, with all good intentions in mind, and that we're not removing one of the most sacred rights of all, the right to vote and dictate our elections, to people that are duly owed the right to vote, that aren't bad actors. There are bad actors out there, but that aren't bad actors. We shouldn't be, prohibiting them from going and voting.
Right, so kind of just tightening up a little bit of the language kind of going on here. But talking a little bit about that, I mean, it's something that you kind of hear kind of murmurs about, especially with, like you mentioned, it's fairly easy, or at least easier than most states to kind of live or try to get an address here, at least from what I've heard and from what I've seen, at least.
I actually met two people. I met two
mailbox.
people, van life people that I believe, they had South Dakota IDs.
Yeah, which is, I mean, and it's like just getting a mailbox here.
Right.
It's pretty simple, at least from what I've heard. But kind of talk a little bit more about this. Talk a little bit about tightening that language. I know you mentioned a little bit of some of the issues you have with it. How would you go about tightening that language? What would you say instead of some of the stuff that's written in here?
I mean, I think the intention is to try to cut back on some of the people that are, using these PMBs, they call them, these mailboxes that aren't PO boxes, because PO boxes you actually can't use as a registration address. It's illegal. But a PMB at a campground, or even a campground address right now in South Dakota, you can use. And so, if that's explicitly what we're trying to do, is remove people's right to vote from a campground address, then again, you're disenfranchising people who live in an RV and permanently have their RV at a campground. You shouldn't disenfranchise those people, but the people that come in for a day that live in their van all over the country, if we did the 30-day requirement, it does at least require people to spend some time here in South Dakota, and that was where my concern lied. But the 30 consecutive days, unless you're showing, I guess, 30 days of receipts of a hotel, but even then somebody could rent a hotel for 30 days, not actually stay in the hotel, and then just show their receipt and come in for a day. So there's all kinds of, bad actors are going to be bad actors no matter how many things you put into place. We see that in campaign finance laws. We see that, with so many other areas of law, that it's really hard to tighten it up. And so you get to a point where you kind of have to balance how much do we want to strap down and tighten the language? Because there are ways to make it so that you completely eliminate the ability for people who live in RVs or, you know, want to vote from a PMB for even, I have a person who reaches out to me all the time that does it for, he was a victim of a crime. And so he doesn't want to be traced back to where he actually lives because he's concerned that his, you know, perpetrator would, you know, come and find him. You have the right to privacy in the United States too, and so you have to balance those interests and how much do you want to, you know, tighten things down where you're starting to disenfranchise people, especially in a state with such a low population and such low voter turnout, especially in our primary elections. You have to really weigh those considerations when you're considering legislation like this.
Now, you have a legislation, I believe, right now floating around that would allow people to challenge voters based on their residency, correct?
Yeah.
Can you explain that? I mean, just because, well, you cooked it up. You're the chef. I mean, I don't want to talk about your recipe here.
So yeah, so this was kind of my angle of trying to fix this problem, was to directly go after the bad actors instead of, you know, trying to change the standard in the middle of the game here with what our residency requirement is going to be. Why don't we just create a challenge process to get the bad actors off the voter rolls if that's really what we're trying to target? And I always ask myself that as a legislator, like, what is the problem and how do we actually tailor a solution to that problem? And so Senate Bill 85 is actually just an expansion of the existing challenge process that we already have in law, that you can disqualify people if they're, you know, mentally incompetent or if they're dead and shouldn't be voting anymore, you know, if they're voting in another state. These were all ways that you could challenge a person previously, but we just expanded it, and this bill is on the governor's desk right now, to being able to challenge people based off of residency requirements. And so right now, my bill would only be able to challenge people under the current residency requirements that we have in law. Obviously, if 1066 is then signed by the governor as well, then my bill would be able to challenge people based off of these new residency requirements. But you know, like I said, the existing process already exists in law. It just expands it. So, like, I have a constituent who actually owns a campground, and he knows of several people who are registered to vote from his address that he has no record of in his books at his campground of ever actually staying with him. And so he could submit an affidavit saying, hey, these people I don't think should be registered. Can you look into them? And they can do that.
One of the things I thought was interesting about your bill is that the challenge has to come from within the county. So if somebody's going to challenge to say, I don't believe you actually live here, that challenge has to come within the county. I'm just curious, like, what drew you to put that language in the bill?
Well, first of all, we have, you know, several groups that are, you know, statewide that, you know, are, I think, doing their best to try to make sure that there are, you know, are stricter election integrity principles put into our system. But I think the intention there was that if you're from the county, you know more about this particular person, or that they're not in the community more than somebody would from Sioux Falls. So if you're challenging a voter in Custer, you know, someone who lives in Custer is going to know more about that person to even include on the affidavit that they have to submit. And so that's the idea, is that it's people from your own community. And if these statewide organizations or even out-of-state national organizations want to come in and challenge our voters here in South Dakota, that they at least have to find essentially like a plaintiff in that county that is willing to submit that challenge. And so it's kind of an extra protection for folks in their own county, so that, you know, if you're going to get challenged, somebody in your own community has to challenge you.
Right.
Well, kind of talking a little bit, let's keep moving forward as we are kind of running out of time here. So let's talk about the final thing. You know, it seems like we go from, you know, kind of challenging that and making sure that we get the right people voting in the state elections, to kind of something else at the to 503. We went from 5,003 to now 503. Could you kind of talk a little bit about that? I believe it is right here, joint resolution proposing and submitting to the voters at the next general election an amendment to the Constitution of the state of South Dakota, clarifying that an individual must be a citizen of the U.S. to be eligible to vote. Can you kind of talk a little bit about kind of this Senate joint resolution here?
Yeah, so I am actually a co-sponsor of this legislation. I actually intended to carry this legislation, and someone else beat me to it, so we worked together on this. So this will be on the ballot in the next election. So you'll see the 60% threshold that we already talked about in addition to this one. And so, like I said, this is one of the last amendments that will pass by simple majority. And then going forward, we're going to have a 60% threshold if the other question does pass. Essentially what this does is it changes language in our Constitution that says every U.S. citizen can vote to only U.S. citizens can vote. And so that kind of little change of terms of art. Actually, there are lots of studies in law that show that municipalities who have home rule in other states have allowed non-U.S. citizens to vote in their local elections. And so this change of kind of almost a term of art in the law will ensure that only U.S. citizens are voting in our South Dakota elections from the statewide level all the way down to our local municipal and school board elections.
And just so I do think it's important to point out the clarification here that this is for local elections, so city elections, not state elections. As you were saying, this comes down to, I believe, the city charters, correct?
Well, and so I guess it will affect everything, right? So if for whatever reason there were non-U.S. citizens voting in statewide, state-level elections, we did have a few people that accidentally got registered that were non-U.S. citizens on our voter rolls that technically, I guess, could have gone and voted in a state-level election. But the concern that this amendment is actually targeted to is, local municipalities that have home rule, they derive their power, inherently government power, from a different place. And so they have the ability to decide things about their local elections that like a state or a county can't because of the way that the sovereign power works. And so this amendment would just, I guess, close that loophole to ensure that we only have U.S. citizens voting in South Dakota.
Now, if I remember right, from the press conference, there are no cities right now currently allowing this, right? In South Dakota, this is more of a preventative bill, so to speak?
Correct. So, you hear about like sanctuary cities, for example, that go against like the federal government. The idea would be the same thing at the state level. Instead of going with like the state law, local areas could technically go against that and allow non-U.S. citizens, so this would prevent that from happening.
Well, I mean, it seems like, it's kind of shocking, at least when you hear like stuff like this happen. It's kind of shocking the fact that a single word or a couple words can actually change what something means, which is crazy to think about, especially when it comes to like how a state is run, or ran, I suppose, right? But kind of talk a little bit more on this.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about this is the Secretary of State is she is fully behind this. I mean, she was at the press conference speaking in support of this. I mean, what did it mean to you to have that support behind this?
Well, it's always really incredible to have a statewide elected official support your bill, whether it's the Attorney General when it's a judicial or criminal bill, or the Secretary of State when it's an election bill. And this year I worked very closely with the Secretary of State. I actually, when I was in college, spent time working in that office as an intern, and so I knew a lot of the folks that still work in that office, and so it was great to get to work with them in that capacity as a legislator now. So I spent a lot of time down there going over all the bills that we just discussed, and there was many more. But yeah, it's really great to have the support of a statewide elected official. And I guess one fun fact that I wanted to share, actually, because people say, oh, well, we don't have non-U.S. citizens voting in our South Dakota elections. Why, it's a preventative measure, but really is this a problem? A lot of people don't know this, but historically in South Dakota, we did have non-U.S. citizens voting for a long time when our state was first established, because there were so many immigrants from European countries that came to settle here. And when women got the right to vote in South Dakota, at the same time, we removed immigrants' rights to vote. And so the governor at the time, in kind of a swift political move, removed immigrants' right to vote and then gave women the right to vote at the same time, but only women that were U.S. citizens. And so there's a long history, actually, in this area in South Dakota, and is the reason why I get to vote today. So.
I always ask this about resolutions. We'll close out with this. How do you think this is going to fare with the voters here?
I mean, I think most voters, when they go to the polls, they probably don't do as much research as they should, and so they just read the description. And I think most people are going to read the description and say, yeah, our South Dakota Constitution should probably say that only U.S. citizens should be able to vote. And so I can probably see this passing with great success. There wasn't a lot of pushback at all, even in the Capitol building with opposition testimony. And so, it really is just a legal thing that much ink has been spilled with legal scholars that we just need to close this loophole. So.
All right. Well, do you have anything else you want to give our viewers, kind of a final message for them who are watching right now?
Well, I would encourage you to, contact your legislators. All of these bills, do impact, your voice and your vote. And I always say that, voting measures, when someone else's right is potentially dampened, it can technically make your vote worth more or less. And so, pay attention to what your neighbors think, or, people in your area, and really be more involved, because all of these bills are really going to change the landscape of elections in South Dakota, and could really change the landscape politically in South Dakota for years and decades to come.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you,
Thank you.
Amber Hulse, for joining us here today. And thank you, most of all, for watching KOTA's Political Pulse today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your Monday. We'll see you here next week.